could tell us who you are and where you're from.
I grew up in Montreal, in Canada, and did a lot of. I started skiing in the Laurentians as a child in the 1930s at Shawbridge, Quebec. The first downhill skiing experiences I had were on the big hill at Shawbridge, where the world's first rope tow was constructed in 1932 by Alex Foster, who was a Montrealer. I grew up and did some racing, went to McGill University, and in 1957, after working in an editorial consulting firm in Montreal, I moved to New York City and was the managing editor of a daily business newspaper. And I opened up the New York Times one day and saw a classified ad from a man who said he was going to start a new national ski magazine. He was looking for an editor. And I went to see him. His name was Arnold Abramson, and had already started Golf magazine. And he was starting a new magazine called Ski Life, which was to compete with the two existing national ski magazines at the time, Ski and Skiing, which had basically started just after World War II. I would have gone to work for Abramson, except he offered me about 50% less than the miserable salary I was already making. So I helped him get it started, the magazine started, and wrote quite a bit for it. He focused on tips. He felt that a huge number of people were coming into skiing, and he found a formula that didn't exist in the extant ski publications, which were the same kind of pointers he was running in Golf magazine. How to do this, how to do that. And it immediately outsold the other magazines on the newsstands. And eventually, when Bill Eldred, who was the owner of Ski Magazine, fell ill in the early 1960s, Bill sold the magazine to Arnold Abramson. And from that time on, for a long time, if you looked at the cover of Ski Magazine, you could see that it said Ski Magazine incorporating Ski Life. And in 1965, he offered me a living wage, and I came on board as the editor-in-chief of Ski Magazine, which I did. I performed more or less in that function, either as editor-in-chief or editorial director, over the next 16 years, I think, which was the longest tenure of any editor of any ski publication, which is a precarious occupation at best. But I say from time. I was sort of in and out on ski because I became involved in other editorial work running the magazines that the Times Mirror Company, I should say that the Times Mirror Company bought Ski Magazine in 1972. And that was not long after the Ziff Davis Company had bought Skiing Magazine. So suddenly it went from national ski publications, which were owned by individuals, to now magazines which were corporate owned and part of a stable with many other magazines. In the case of Times Mirror, with Popular Science and Outdoor Life and Ski and Golf. And I was the editorial director there for a number of years, although I kept a hand in ski.
So these two giants were still competing in the same spirit.
Yes, they've always competed, or they did always compete vigorously until 1987, when it came into the possession of some corporate genius's mind at the Times Mirror Company in Los Angeles that it would be a good idea, instead of owning one ski magazine, which ought to be demanding enough and risky enough, they wanted to buy the other one. So Ski and Skiing came under common ownership, and have been to this day. They were eventually purchased by Time Warner, who now owns both Ski and Skiing. And around 1987, that era of competition that had existed for so many years between Ski and Skiing ended. except for one thing. At that time, the New York Times Company decided to enter the ski publishing field with a magazine called Snow Country, and they hired me to do the startup of Snow Country. And so I was the editor-in-chief and founding editor of Snow Country from 1988 to 1998 when I retired.
Now, what was the circulation when you ended your time with Snow Country?
Well, it was over 400,000, and so was ski, and I think skiing was. I think both those magazines were around 450,000. The nature of the circulation of the ski magazines, however, has changed. At one time it was you subscribed to a magazine and you sent in your dollar and you got it. Shifting ahead to today, a lot of magazine circulation today is directed at a specified readership of people who are sent the magazine, and they don't necessarily have to pay for it. So today, I would say a lot of the circulation of the all of the ski publications is free controlled. To give you an example of what that change means, the average single or newsstand sale of a ski magazine today is probably around 13 or 14,000. In 1968, which was the year of the Grenoble Winter Olympics, in the year of Jean-Claude Killy, newsstand sales were about $68,000 per copy, per issue rather.
That's huge.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to, step back a bit. You were telling us, was the Redbird Ski Club exclusively McGill? Maybe you can talk a little bit about that. And don't forget the Penguins.
Yeah, as far as I can remember, I went to McGill, and I think it was the year I graduated, I was invited to join the Redbird Ski Club because I competed and knew all the guys. And we had a house located between Piedmont and Saint-Sever and the Laurentians. And right across the valley, about 400 yards away, the Redbirds it was an all-male club, and 400 yards away was the Penguin Ski Club, which was an all-female club and included some quite well-known skiers like the Wörtel twins and Joanne Hewson were members of the Redbirds. There were many joint parties involving transporting pianos and other objects across the snow between the two buildings.
Well, now, maybe you can describe the terrain around Shawbridge where that first rope tow is. What are those?
At Shawbridge, yeah.
Yeah, what's the terrain like there?
Well, yeah, that's the southern end of the Laurentians, Shawbridge. And there was a big hill there, but I can remember skiing at Saint-Sever, and at the end of the day taking the last ride up the Hill 70 rope tow, and then at that time you had a Kandahar binding with side hooks on it, and you undid the side hooks and you did a cross-country tour, and then you skied down into Shawbridge. And there was a famous club there called the Laurentian Lodge Club, known briefly as the Shawbridge Club. My parents were members of it, and we went there as kids. And one of the highlights of the day was going out on a cross-country tour with Herman Smith, Jack Rabbit Johansson, who was kind of I wouldn't call him the resident pro, but he knew all of the members, and he lived just down the street in Piedmont, so he took the kids out. He didn't think much of Alec Foster's rope tow. He thought it was just a stupid invention and that people should climb hills if they wanted to ski. So we were told that as children, but we all wanted to ski on the rope tow hill.
Well, and of course, in the early days, nobody really saw a ski explosion coming. I'm kind of curious what you think. Did alpine skiing already have like a golden era? Was the 60s, when you look back on it, do you think some sort of blossom time for alpine skiing, at least in America?
Well, I think the 50s and the 60s were the time of the most explosive growth in skiing, but we know that's demographically related. Basically it was the children who formed the great bulge in the American population, the baby boomers, who and at one time, for several years, the sport was growing at 10 or 15% a year. You have to remember in the period at the end of World War II, there were probably, I'm sure there were less than, probably only 50 or 60 viable operating ski areas. It's hard to know because there's so many little rope tow things around. And by 1970, there were probably over close to 500 comparable ski areas, I mean, with cable lifts and so on. So not only was it the most explosive era, the 1950s and 60s, in terms of the growth in the number of skiers, but also when basically all of the ski areas were created, with the exception, well, I would say up until the mid 70s, and then after the passage of the Environmental Policy Act, an EPA as we call it in any event, in the early 1970s, coupled with economic weakness, ski area construction slowed down. And I think it's also true that within the permit areas of the U.S. Forest Service, that many of the great mountains had already been built upon. By the early 1980s, with the completion of Beaver Creek and Deer Valley, for all practical purposes, major ski area construction stopped.
Talking of these ski areas in that breadth of time, do certain ski areas really help define the sport? And I guess what I'm saying is what comes to mind, for example, Vail. I mean, what is it defined? It's taken us in a certain direction, and you could say maybe the same thing about some other ski area, like the extreme of Jackson Hole or the village of Vail. I mean, do they each one sort of take us off in a direction, these major resorts?
Well, I think there's a lot of individual characteristics. It's hard to generalize. I mean, I think that we have essentially, in the long run, with the major resorts, we moved into the pattern of what was earlier established in the Alps, in resorts like St. Moritz and Davos, and I'm trying to think of some other examples. The only different, even Sestriere is perhaps a more direct example to American ski area. Sestriere was the first built from the ground, tabula rasa ski resort in the world, as far as I know, in Italy, where the alpine events of the 2006 Olympics were built. And it was financed a lot with Fiat automobile money, the Agnelli family. When you look at Vail, you're sort of looking at a recreation of a Sestriere, a place that was started from nothing, or Sun Valley was the next one that was created like that. There was nothing there. And Vail was certainly like that. Snowbird, a bunch of ski areas. Then there were others that were more comparable to European, to Europe ski resorts, where there was already a village catering to tourists. For example, Stowe, Franconia, North Conway, where skiing was an addendum to the summer resorts. And then out west, you had more examples of defunct mining towns that came back to life again, Breckenridge and Aspen being examples.
That's great. We're going to maybe make another step there from the resorts to, what do you think, what was the contribution of the 10th mountain? Maybe you could define that. We've talked a little bit about the baby boomers, but what did the 10th contribute to skiing in this country?
Well, I think it's been a well-told story, and I think an enormous amount. I mean, without these guys and their enthusiasm and their ability to ski and their knowledge of a sport which wasn't that well known, a lot of the things that happened, would have taken longer to do. I can't say that, that it was indispensable. You should also remember, though, and this is a cautionary, and it's no discredit to the 10th Mountain Division, But most of the guys who came out of the 10th Mountain Division didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. And it took some pretty wealthy guys to make their dreams come true. I mean, at Aspen, you had Walter Pepke of the Container Corporation of America, without whose initiative and money, a lot of those things would not have happened, and his brother-in-law, Paul Nitze. At Squaw Valley couldn't have got going unless Alex Cushing knew a lot of wealthy people back in New York. Stowe began to be built because C.V. Starr of the AIG insurance company took an interest in skiing. Tremblant was built because Joe Ryan in Philadelphia happened to inherit a lot of money and was an enthusiastic skier. And I could go on and on. Lawrence Rockefeller, many wealthy people took an interest in the sport and financed it.
We're going to shift gears again, going now to that question about skiing heritage, and I guess I'm looking for the value of skiing heritage and this publication. What's the value of having a publication about it?
Well, I think it's enormously valuable, and it's to the great credit of Mason Beakley, another wealthy gentleman who had an enthusiasm, thankfully, for skiing, that we have the publication Skiing Heritage today. He had the vision to see that something like that was needed. We did not have it in American skiing. Every sport that you participate in is enriched if you know something of its history. What would it be like to play golf and not have an interest in what happens at Augusta or tennis, not to know something of the great champions in the U.S. Open. And so skiing, I think people's experience of skiing is similarly enriched if they get to know a little of the history of the sport. It's more fun when you're watching the Olympics on television to know something about the past champions and what their accomplishments were.
We're going to have to fix this. So hold that thought. That's the problem with heat and tape.
All right.
And now you can just raise it up, just show it to me.
Yeah, I think, shall I talk?
No, just show it like just put it on your chest.
There you go. Yeah, this is that simple. Let's do that move again. So you got it in your hands and you just.
Right.
Okay.
That's it. I mean, that's what we're looking for.
You can bring it a little bit even higher. That will be
Okay.
higher. Awesome. Yeah. Perfect. Okay.
Yeah, okay, we're just gonna pick up our conversation. So, looking at the value of having a publication, we'll take it right from the top,
Yeah.
and we can intercut them. But, the value of having a publication about
Yeah.
skiing heritage.
Well, I think the value is to the reader, because I think anybody who reads Skiing Heritage, which is a quarterly journal, or if you're not into reading on paper, the International Skiing History Association has the world's most extensive website dedicated to the history of the sport. It's an extraordinary resource for people to go to look up the first of this, or what the championship records were, or to keep current with historical figures who may have passed away in the sport. But going back to the publication, by reading it, you find that your appreciation of the sport grows. So, for example, you might be skiing at Aspen on Ruthie's Run. Well, you might enjoy your run on Ruthie's, but you're going to enjoy it a whole lot more if you read a history of Ruthie's. Or, if you know something about the old lodges in Aspen and Stowe. Skiing Heritage runs a series of articles on historic lodges, some of which are still open and you can go and stay in them. You can ski trails from Squaw Valley to Mount Mansfield to anywhere in the Midwest, and you'll find stories in Skiing Heritage about those ski areas and what their history is, and then consequently your appreciation of the sport, I think, grows as it does in golf and tennis or any sport, sailing. So but that element which exists in other sports, which had strong national and international associations that had an interest in the history of their sport, has come rather recently in skiing. I mean, the FIS, the Fédération Internationale de Ski, or the International Ski Federation, commonly known as FIS, only with some prodding from our International Skiing History Association, has decided to move ahead with a timeline, international timeline of the sport, and their own website dedicated to skiing history. So we think we're doing some moving and shaking here, and I think it will redound to the great benefit of the sport.
Is it fair to say that in a way you're participating in or expanding your sense of ski culture by understanding the past?
Absolutely. As you well know, Rick, one of the most famous quote in skiing came from the instructor Otto Schneebs, who told us somewhere in the late 1920s that skiing is not a sport, it's a way of life. And it was such a prophetic statement because of the whole culture of skiing that arose, and the ski bum, and the people who said, I'm just coming to this ski area for one winter to teach, and then I'll go back and get a serious job, and who never did and made it their life. And, it spawned a culture of ski songs, which we don't hear much anymore, but one of the little side projects of the International Skiing History Association, working with people like Bill Briggs, is to, record those ski songs that used to be sung so lustily in the 1950s and 1960s. And then really skiing was responsible for the creation of whole towns. Vail being one, the whole cluster of homes around Squaw Valley and other resorts are there primarily because skiing triggered their creation.
Did that trigger your publication? Maybe you can speak to that name you chose, Snow Country.
Well, Snow Country had a curious history because the New York Times Company actually published a magazine in the late 1960s. Not the New York Times Company, Golf Digest in the late 1960s briefly had a flirtation with ski publishing. They thought there was a place for a news publication with a lot of current events, particularly races. And they probably weren't that far off, except that didn't work for them, and then the New York Times acquired them, and they forgot about ski publishing. And then Bill Tandler, I think, started ski racing sometime in the early 70s, and we still have that publication today, which is invaluable, I think. And it's just now owned again by Gary Black, who is one of the great supporters of skiing heritage and the International Skiing History Association. He's in Sun Valley. So when I came to the New York Times in the summer of 1987, they insisted on the use of the name that they had already had in the late 60s, Snow Country. And I began to think, why do we need yet another ski magazine? And I began to think about the name. And I remember somebody once said to me, well, why not focus on the place where skiing takes place rather than the skiing itself? And then you could, with that lens, looking at it that way, you could shape a totally different kind of ski magazine, which would focus on the place, Schneeb's lifestyle, and what it was all about. Not that we wouldn't have racing and all the other things in the magazine, but so I began to develop not as a ski or skiing magazine, but more like an Arizona Highways or a New England magazine, as edited more like a regional magazine about a place. And that place was the 300 or 400 places around America where skiing takes place and what goes on in them. And the moment you started to look at the sport that way, you came up with ideas about the people who lived there, craftsmen, shops, what was happening in that place called Snow Country. I even, with the research department of the New York Times, we even conducted a study. We found where 50% of the lift capacity in the United States was, and we went into the demographic and income data for the counties where skiing was concentrated. And lo and behold, we found what everybody could see in front of their eyes. This place was growing far faster than any other counties in the United States, with the possible exception of seashore or marina places. Construction was growing. New businesses were opening at a very rapid rate. And what was strange about it was that everybody said that skiing was slowing down, which was true. Participation in even as participation in skiing was slowing down, the place itself was growing. So I decided, well, that's a more positive story than writing about a sport that's not growing anymore. So we had a success, but like a lot of the ski publications, unfortunately, it only had about a 12-year lifespan, and it never was profitable. Ski publications have always had a problem of 6 months of revenue and 12 months of expense. Yeah.
Maybe with our skiing heritage, I mean, I know everybody is such a committed group.
Yeah, well, that's given us, some of us veterans of ski publishing, a chance to, to start a new kind of ski publication. And I would like to see Skiing Heritage grow in a similar way, to be a journal of popular history that's fun and entertaining for people to read about the past, at the same time as holding to our responsibility to have the most accurate information factually correct. And I've got to tell you, that is an extraordinarily difficult thing. I have just completed, after 5 years, writing a book called The Story of Modern Skiing, and it's about the revolutionary changes that took place in the sport after World War II until the end of the 20th century. And I say revolutionary because although the history of skiing before World War II is well documented, and it was certainly, the sport was invented during that period, the most dramatic changes in technique, in how the sport is taught, in resorts, in ski equipment itself, with the going from wooden skis to titanium, to from leather to plastic. And it has absolutely transformed the sport. But as I got more deeply into it, and I'm saying this because it's also true of the articles in Skiing Heritage, it was a formidable job. I wound up writing 500 footnotes, sourcing all of this material. And that's what we're trying to do on Skiing Heritage. There are two aspects of skiing history. One, a very popular one, is called oral history, and they're terrific because you get old goats like me sitting in front of a camera trying to remember things, but at least you capture the color of these people and the anecdotal stuff. But oral histories are unreliable in terms of accuracy, and I don't mean that in a demeaning way, because sitting here, I may have told you something, but I would like to go back and fact check it. And that's what we do on Skiing History, and we require of our writers, and we provide them with the historical data to write these articles so that we get it factually correct. So it's a difficult task we have, but that's what we're trying to do with Skiing Heritage, is to have a journal of popular history, however, that is meticulously researched.
That's good, thanks. What would you say to someone who asks you, I'm thinking of joining ISHA, but what are the benefits?
Well, the benefits are primarily receiving Skiing Heritage and knowing that you're a supporter of a cause. It's costs $40 to join the International Skiing History Association, and I can tell you that we don't have any advertising, and our cost of it costs us about 1/3 more to put it out than the revenue we receive from memberships. So we also have to do fundraising. It's very much of a pro bono operation. And I would say the benefits are the satisfaction of knowing that you're supporting an enormously worthwhile cause. It's amassing a great deal of history for the future. And so it's a part of giving back to the sport. Now there's some incidental benefits. We have an annual skiing heritage week, which we've had in places like Sun Valley and Stowe and Vail. We tend to move around to make contact with different parts of the country, and our members come together once a year and experience a very pleasant time talking with other history buffs.
So you're becoming part of something when you join Aisha.
Oh, definitely, yeah. Part of a wonderfully enthusiastic group of skiers, and they aren't necessarily all old. I mean, it's a mistake to make a kind of an iron connection between being interested in history and being old. I think many young people have an interest in the past. If they have any curiosity, whatever age you are, you want to know more about why is this here. I just recently wrote a piece for Skiing Heritage on Bodie Miller, but what I did with Bodie Miller was to put him in the context of history. What has he accomplished, but what have the people who've come before Bodie Miller accomplished? And one of the benefits of that was that we found out that Bodie himself has a tremendous interest in skiing history. And he's become a great supporter of the International Skiing History Association and of skiing heritage. He loves the history of his sport.
I wonder if he'd give us a testimonial for this DVD, if we could catch him in the summer.
Sure. I'm sure he would,
Yeah.
because he's given us written testimonials.
It might be a possibility to catch up with him. Well, I need to jump in quickly here to freestyle. Why did freestyle emerge? I mean, was it an event of some kind for enthusiasm in skiing, or a different path?
Well, there's always been a lot of stunt skiing that's gone on. I mean, I think some of it goes back to early in the 20th century. I remember seeing old film footage, you may have seen it, of the Ruud brothers, Birger and Sigmund Ruud, doing flips off of jumps in Norway. And then Stein Eriksen, when he came to the United States in the 1950s, began to do flips wherever he happened to be the ski school director, which happened to be a lot of different places. And then Doug Pfeiffer, around 1957, when he brought out his first ski instruction book, he had 8 pages in it of stunts, including what we now call the Royal Christie, which was really a figure skating stunt, which goes back to a man by the name of Fritz Ruel, R-E-U-E-L. I think you pronounce his name Royal, and then it became, we've forgotten about Fritz Royal. It's now the Royal Christie, as if it was some kingly thing to do. But so Doug was a real pioneer in that regard, and then some of the Europeans came who were really good gymnasts. I mean, Art Führer, Hermann Gillner, and others who, began to do even more extraordinary stunts. You have to remember that it was a pretty challenging thing. When Stein Eriksen was doing his somersaults, he was doing them on 220 centimeter skis. And these guys were doing a lot of their stunts on 210s. Now you see that in the Olympics, these guys that go 60 feet up in the air, but they're on like something that's a little longer than a shoe. So, but it still goes back to that era. Well, then a strange thing happened. The gymnastics and the stunts were all there, but as you know, there was a profound culture change in the 1960s, and there was a tremendous sense of rebelliousness and youth. And once again, going back to our friend Otto Schneebs, since skiing is a lifestyle, this rebellion. I mean, there was on the one hand the revolution of the stunts you could do, then it had to get into the lifestyle. Well, there was a culture of lifestyle of rejecting all of the values of your parents. Certainly, it was associated with pot smoking and a lot of other stuff that was going on at that time, including growing your hair very long. And these young people felt that the existing skiing as we'd known it, ski school forms as directed by the Professional Ski Instructors of America, disciplined training for racing as dictated by the United States ski team, was just too much. It was more than they can bear. Skiing had all this wonderful other stuff that you could do, jumping up in the air and doing just, getting off the edge of your skis. If they told you to ski on the outside ski, to hell with it. Ski on your inside ski. Anything to rebel. I don't quite recall how the name hot dogging got associated with it, but they became known as the hot doggers. And so it became a revolution not only in skiing but in lifestyle. And but gradually, like all these things that have happened in skiing, the chaos couldn't continue forever. It had to get some structure, and then some people began to create forms of competition. There were two kinds. One was a very formal thing, which probably naturally happened in New England with, was it Peter Pinkham? I think was his name. He created a ski masters thing, which nobody thought was terribly exciting. And then Doug Pfeiffer and Tom Corcoran got together at Waterville Valley, I think it was in 1972, and created, I think it was the first competition. But actually, it wasn't quite, because at that time in the late 60s, Friedel Pfeiffer had organized a professional ski racing tour, and it was kind of dull just to watch guys go up and down the course going head to head. So to give a little entertainment at the beginning of those races, they had the racers do stunts. And Doug Pfeiffer and some others used to judge those. But then they finally said, well, all of these stunts that are being done, we ought to have a competition and score it by style points as you do in other sports. I mean, figure skating or ski jumping has an element of both distance and style. And from that point on, it became more structured, formalized. There were a couple of terrible accidents in which performers suffered debilitating spinal cord injuries, and the thing slowed down for a long time. There was basically a prohibition in American freestyle skiing against doing inverted aerials. An inverted aerial meaning you had to going upside down in the air. And the force of that prohibition actually drove the sport abroad, because the FIS and Canada and others didn't think there was a problem in the manner that the American ski areas thought there were. So for freestyle to move ahead competitively, basically it shifted to Europe, and around 1980, the FIS endorsed it as a sport. And finally, it brought it to the point where it could become an Olympic demonstration sport, and at that point, the resistance in the United States ceased. And we have what we have today, except for, I think, one of the most wonderful visual things in freestyle in the 70s and even going into the 80s was ski ballet. And for some mysterious reason, it was briefly a demonstration sport, but did not survive.
Just to wrap up here, we got a few seconds. Is there a philosophy or a parallel to snowboards and snowboarding, the rebel thing?
Oh, absolutely. Again, you go back to this lifestyle revolution thing. I mean, in the early 80s, kids led, by the pioneering that Jake Burton Carpenter in Vermont did in developing a better and better snowboard, got into, well, there must be a different way to go downhill so we can be different. And it was almost a repetition of the freestyle thing. You know, when freestyle first came along and the ski area operators looked at these guys and the stunts they were doing, and the aroma of marijuana on the hill, I thought, these are not the kind of people that we want to have around when we're selling family ski vacations. The same, here you are about 15 years later, and the same age kids show up on the slope on one board, you know, and you know, the ski area operators took one look at them and said, this is not the kind of person we want to have around if we're going to sell family ski vacations. And many of them still, there are still a few left that still don't want them on the slopes. But I think it has to more has to do with safety reasons. I think there is a real problem between skiing and snowboarding, having to do with the vision and the way people come down the hill, also relating to the age of the participant and so on. And it's created a problem in skiing, a perception, particularly by older skiers, that there's something unsafe about what's going on.
It's great. I think we're there with a few seconds left.
Well done.
Gee, we have to go skiing. It's not
Absolutely, it's great powder. Who wants to hang around here?
It was great. We don't have to
All right.
take off a mic, and it was a good job.
Thanks. Well, thank you for doing